fellow in there that I've been working with, and he's coming out. And what do I do now that he's coming out? I want to support this guy coming out. So if you want to get, I said to the first thing, don't do it by yourself. You got to work with somebody. You have people that you're accountable to and support you. So there you go. If anyone wants to help Claudia and be companions to her in whatever way she can use, there's a starting point. Is that okay?
You're good. You look great.
How does my hair look, actually? As
No, Eric, we can work on that. You look real good in here.
we have a little healing prayer, maybe over to the side. Okay. I thought one of the things that I heard, because some of you aren't coming, I'm going to talk some tonight about a Catholic priest you probably all know, Father Greg Boyle down in Homeboy Industries in California. Do you know about Father Boyle? You know, have you seen some of his videos and so on? We went down there a few years ago to attend this at the retreat center at invitation of one of the foundations. But we spent a few hours at Homeboy Industries, which is right in the gang area that Father Boyle has worked with. Amazing place. But his heart, his approach, his humor, and he started this program that brought gang members together to work together. You know, with the slogan, they have these little T-shirts, nothing stops a bullet like a job, you know, for example. But he's an amazing guy. But we talked a bit about the shame that people carry and so on, and how to help people find themselves. Father Boyle says, for people who want to be involved, he says, we don't save them, we see them. We don't save them, we see them. And the program has grown. It's a $20 million a year operation down there in Los Angeles. So I'm going to have just a short video for those of you who won't be here to see and hear some of what he says, because you'll catch a bit of the flavor. And I think he addresses the power of love. And in terms of people being able to find themselves again. We may need the lights off. This is part of a commencement address. You may have seen it online already at Pepperdine. How do these go off?
So I picked these two guys, Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked in the bakery, and Mario, who worked in our merchandise store. I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times with men and women. I've never picked anybody more terrified of flying than this guy, Mario. He was just absolutely petrified. In fact, he was hyperventilating. And we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. And so we're at Burbank Airport, and the big bay windows, and Southwest Airlines, they don't have that hermetically sealed chute where you walk onto the plane, you walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb the steps to go to the front of the plane, or the back of the plane, they have steps. And so our plane arrives, it's early morning, and I tell Mario, there's our plane, and I think, wow, he may actually die before we climb those steps. And then our flight crew arrives, and I see two flight attendants, females, and they both have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. there they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that Mario, in our 30-year history at Homeboy, is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there. His arms are all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there's no doubt. And so I've never been in public with him, and we're walking, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids more closely, and I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday and ask anybody there who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works there, they won't say me, they'll say Mario. He sells baked goods at the counter at our cafe. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, and they don't just have the talk at night, they have all these other talks throughout the day, and I tell them, you get up and give those talks, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. And they were terrified, but they did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind that led the audience to stand in awe at what these two had carried in their lives rather than in judgment at how they carried it. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. So the nighttime talk comes, and it's 1,000 people, and I invite them up to share their stories in front of all these people for 5 minutes each, and I do my thing, and then I invite them up for Q&A, and I said, yes, ma'am, and a woman stands, and she says, yeah, I got a question, it's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario steps up to the microphone, he's a tall drink of water, skinny, and clutching the microphone, and he's terrified. Yes. And she says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What advice do you give them? What wisdom do you impart to them? And Mario clutches his microphone, and he's just terrified, and he's trembling, and he's getting a hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. When finally he blurts out, and he stops. And he retreats back to his microphone clutching, terrified retreat. But he wants to get this whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hand, so overwhelmed with emotion that this room full of people, strangers, had returned him to himself, and they were returned to themselves. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in.
There we are. Yes, I want to talk about just some of the nuts and bolts of Dismas Fellowship, some of the guidelines that we have established, and how this thing works. And in 12-step programs, they say you may not agree with everything you hear there. You may not fit you at all. Take what you need, they say, when you go to a 12-step meeting. And take what you need. So I offer that to you. If this is anything here that's helpful to you in developing a response to the issue of aftercare, take what you need. I like this video. I like this photo of holding on to a person who's in trouble and who's in anguish. You need a community. Remember the killing of the young soldier in Ottawa, Nathan, was his name? He was from Hamilton. I remember that day, and the people came around him, and it seemed like he had this community formed. They were trying to revive him. Some of them, as a nurse, were trying to care for him that way. One of the other people was there, just reminding him, "You're a good son." He was affirming him and loving him and so on. We need a community just to, as Father Boyle says, to return us to ourselves sometimes. And Dismas is a place where former prisoners, faith-based volunteers can safely experience community. This was at our Christmas last year, and Louis, that's Mike there. He was one of the pigs in this impromptu It's this impromptu Christmas pageant that we had. But it's what I see is this place of encounter. So we're not asking people to enter into a program and programs are important. The Circles program that in Hank's work that you were doing there with the Open Circles program, Touchstone, others. But this is a place of hospitality. People can come and help put a meal on, sit down at the table, and 3 months later they may come back. Maybe they never come back. We find that it has that. We want to know who's coming, but often 4 or 5 different people are coming with different interests. It almost is like a little impromptu restorative justice community. And but here you can experience one another and hear one another's story. That's the most important thing. Here's some of the influences as I see it. First, AA. The AA principles, all of these kind of help shape the development of this thing. The AA principles, I mean, of having just a very simple kind of liturgy, steps, a prayer, a story at the core, but also not dependent on government money. So you're self-sufficient, right? You don't look to the government. With all of the entanglements that can create, you work with. We need government. But when government funding becomes the issue, you need reports, you need outcomes, you need all that stuff. So AA doesn't do that. And it still continues on, doesn't it? In all of its variations, all of its 12-step variations. Did I say this morning that Scott Peck, the psychologist Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled and so on, he said that the most significant spiritual events in the last 2,000 years since Bethlehem has that meeting between Dr. Bob and Bill W. He called it that. So the impact that the 12-step movement, which itself began in an encounter, which itself borrowed from the Oxford movement and so on. I mean, we're all dependent on one another. So this thing, the 12-step movement, has really struck me in the groups that I've been part of and attended, the importance of story, the importance of non-judgment, the fact that we all shared that we've screwed up, really. We're here, we have, and we need one another. We need the spirituality of knowing that we are cared about. But it's also, the fellowship meal. This is really crucial. You got to have food if you want to have community, don't you? Those of you, some of you are doing that. Is it Melinda I was talking with who's doing it in your community there? So we begin with food, and the folks who come help prepare it sometimes, or help various kinds of roles. It's one of the things that's really important is that people can have roles to do. But it's also a circle of trust. So the circle, the food be first, the circle, and then kind of an AA influence. So I'll go through it some. So what happens at a Dismas fellowship? So this is kind of a format that many of us use there. So we get there and we put the coffee on, we set up the tables, we have the name tags out, so a person comes and finds its name tags. And folks start arriving, 4 o'clock, 4:30. We eat. This is in Toronto. It's other groups a bit later. We have our meal. And then we have the circle afterwards, which involves singing. We got some goofy songs we sing, some spiritual songs. And then we follow with the Dismas story. One of the members always tells that story of the encounter, between Jesus and the convict. We recite our values, and we share our Dismas prayer. And then afterwards, the circle, we start with a short kind of reflection or input. It can be a personal story. Someone can take a theme from either scripture or just in life, fear, thanksgiving, gratitude. Can be, I've often used, if I can find a short clips, video, which lead then to a reflection question. to allow people to share from their experience, strength, and hope. Another AA slogan. So we're not there to preach to one another. We're not there for crosstalk. We're not there for religious language to set people straight. What's your story? For me, let me just pause a second. One of the most significant gospel passages that helped to see what this was about, this whole, what are we doing here going inside? What's this about? Was that story where Jesus comes across, he's late at night and he's crossing the lake. Is it Mark 6, Mark 5, I think it is. There's other gospels has it, long passage. And this guy, he's up in the tombs area, outside of the town of the Gadarene town there. It's waving and screaming at him, and he's naked, and he's screaming at the top of his lung, and his arms are all slashed up. You've seen it in prison if you go, particularly among the women's prison. All of those marks on your arms, you know. And this guy has got his arms all slashed up, and he comes racing down toward the mountain where Jesus has just landed. What do we wonder? What are you doing here? Why? What do we have to do with you? And Jesus, there's this moment of kind of deliverance, of healing. Remember these demons that have held him? But for me, the core of the story is, and Jesus says, what's your name? You know, who are you? What is your story? And you remember his response, my name is Legion. There's thousands of us. There's thousands of these uncontrollable impulses, images, persons within me. And soon the townspeople come out and they find this. I called him Pigman because he spent all of the time with the pigs. Right? Have you ever been around someone who works with pigs and farms pigs? We had a guy, Lamar. He used to come to our church, and he was a pig farmer. I knew when he entered the church at the service, he'd come in. I didn't have to look around. Lamar's here, that's a strong odor when you're working with pigs. So I called this guy Pigman. And they find Pigman naked and sane and clothed in his right mind. And you know what? What do? They're afraid. They're afraid. And they say, Jesus, get out of here. What have you done? They'd rather have the guy, Pigman, like he was, up there screaming and cutting himself with the stones and rocks than this character. What do we do with him now? Because we have the issue of reintegration. Where's he going to live? We're going to find a safe place for him to live. Who is going to be his friends? Who's going to give him something to do? You want your kids on the same street as Pigman? Back in the town again. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? He begs Jesus to go with him. Get in the boat. No, you got a job to do. Go back there and tell your story. I found this such a metaphor of what happens. Whether it's Charlie Taylor coming out. He came out of our church shortly after he arrived, and some guy across the street started screaming after a Sunday morning service. We know what you've done. We don't want you here. I'm going to shoot you, he said. And he had two young kids there, and some of the other neighbors started coming out of their doors, saying and arguing with him. It was the worst nightmare. I said, oh, Lord, no, what have we got ourselves into? Excuse me, let me just get a thing of water there. Ron, could you get me one? And he had been drinking. He said, Charlie, go home. And Charlie went home and he called the police. I said to our folks, you go home and pray. Where was this going to lead? The next day I drove up to in front of our little church at Welcome Inn, and he's out there. He said, Pastor, can I talk to you? He was sober. You don't have to be afraid of me. Thank you. I'm not going to hurt that man. And then he revealed that he too had been in a home with Christian brothers where he had been sexually assaulted. So we had this thing going on. Here's this guy moving in my neighborhood who's an offender. He didn't know his history. Here's this man across the street raising 2 young kids who's been a victim. And he said, well, look, came in, he showed me, he just received a compensation check, a $28,000 compensation check for that experience. So why don't you come on over and join us? Bring your kids. That might have been a mistake, because the next Sunday he brought his kids over and something had gone wrong with their stove. So we're trying to have church. We got the smell of bacon and eggs coming up from the basement, you know. He didn't last long in the community, but what is your story? So that's what the circle is about. How do we share our story, our experience, our strength and hope? Without saying, well, you know, this is what the Bible says about that, or this is what you do. Just share your story. And we find that kind of gives freedom. And you don't have to share it. You can pass. You can pass, but no crosstalk. I got off track, didn't I? And then at 8 or so, we end in the circle. We have a sharing prayer. We hold hands and we sing, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You know the story. We put ourselves back there with the convict. We become the convict. Jesus, remember me. And that's how we conclude. So that's basically, the format of a Dismas fellowship. These are the values. These are the values that we worked out. This is the equivalent of our 12 steps in AA. We worked these out together. Ex-prisoners and volunteers and so on. We had a retreat and we said, these are things that are important to us. We read them each time. So we'll ask somebody, would somebody read these for us? Louis, I see you're falling asleep a bit there. I'm sorry about that. Would you mind reading our values as we go through?
Welcome and celebrate one another, regardless of religious or criminal convictions, knowing that we are all offenders. We encourage everyone to give of themselves in some way, cooking meals, setting and cleaning up, sharing our truth, and reaching out to others.
Just important that people have a way, and there's dignity in giving, dignity in serving. Sorry. Sorry.
Our way by sharing the cost of food and accommodation. In the circle, everyone is given the opportunity to speak or to pass.
This was taken at the Brampton Circle a couple of weeks ago, and this is their small group circle. This is something that I found interesting within this, the kind of creativity that comes. This is JJ, who's done some time. It's a provincial time, but has come out. JJ's got a job now, bought a house, and has opened it up for other ex-prisoners to live in, including one guy from the shelter. Sort of like this kind of creative way. This is what I can do. This is something that we can do to create community, which is what I find when we come together, not necessarily as part of a program where we are served, but hey, how can we serve one another? So that sort of releases something.
We will treat each other's story with confidentiality and love. Each story is sacred.
This is Gordy, who you met in the video before. And this is Neil, who's an ex-police superintendent, and they became buddies and walked alongside one another.
We are committed to being a safe and responsible fellowship with accountability to the church where our meetings are held. We are committed to ministering to each other as if they were Christ.
So those are the values that we have developed for our fellowship. They're not like the 12 steps, which really become steps towards sobriety. But these things shape us. We keep coming back to them. And we asked someone who has just read it, which one is meaningful to you this week? We asked the person, and so that person will share. I remember a couple of weeks ago, one of the guys who has cerebral palsy said, where is it? Yeah, each story is sacred. That what Dismas did for him, and he's shaking, is it allows my voice to be heard. It gives me a voice. So people will comment in that way. And then we have our Dismas prayer. You know the AA prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change. This is kind of our version of it. Let's pray it together, could we? Dear God, in your mercy remember me and forgive me for the wrongs I've done. Set me free of my deep fears and resentments. Melt the hard places of my heart. Allow me the grace to surrender this day to your loving care. Amen. In fact, one of the fellowships, the fellowship in Hamilton, has actually put this thing to music.
In your mercy remember me, in your grace set me free from resentments and deep fears. In your mercy remember me, melt the cold places of my heart, release the dark fears of my soul, surrender to your higher love, for in love we'll surely grow. In your mercy remember me, in your grace set me free from resentments and deep fears. In your mercy remember me, melt the cold places of my heart, release the dark fears of my soul, surrender to your higher love, for in love we'll surely grow. In your mercy remember me, in your grace set me free from resentments and deep fears. In your mercy remember me, in your mercy remember me, in your mercy remember, mercy remember, mercy remember me.
Use every excuse to celebrate. This is something that we find that for as you know, for so many folks who've never had birthday parties, who have never had any acknowledgement of life's milestones and that of achievements and so on. We use every excuse to celebrate. Now we used to do this. This is Mike, of course. Some of you remember. We used to sing the song each time in Toronto, "On the Wings of a Dove." On the wings of a snow white dove, he sent, you know that song? Well, then it was an initiation song. So if it's the first time for someone, you get up. And Mike would lead it. Mike would lead this silly dance around the circle. We stopped doing that. There was some, it just doesn't suit our situation. But it was a fun thing to do. It was a fun, expressive, bodily movement thing to do. And there's Joseph. There he is beside Jan, who's a street chaplain. And Joey, who did... Gosh, she's 30 years plus. I remember her when she was a kid in Grand Valley Institution before they closed the place. And that's Joey. Dismas is about relationships. I'm going to talk about this gal tonight a little bit more in terms of what's love got to do with it. No fixing, no saving, no advising, no setting each other straight. I think it's a wonderful video about Jean Vanier, who speaks about how we encounter one another. It's in a little different context, but I think so applicable to what it is that we do.
changes if I see the other person as precious. Not talking about his religion, not talking about his culture. It's about our common humanity. So here is the complexity of relationship. And maybe we can only really discover what our humanity is when I meet the different. Because I can think that humanity is my culture and that we are the best. And we can become victims of others, or we can victimize others. We are the good ones and the others are the bad ones. And so we create walls. So what is important is helping people to grow to become free from fear, fear of the others, free to open ourselves up to other couples. Tell me your story, because each one has a story. I'm not there to change you. I'm there to walk with you, and maybe in listening to you, to reveal to you that you're a precious person. You may be very different in your religion, but the important thing is, if you can somewhere get out of your tribe and meet me as a human person, then things begin to change. Meeting, to meet each other. The extraordinary thing is, if we learn to love the enemy will change me. So help me discover maybe the greatest enemy is in myself, with my protective defense mechanisms, my need to prove that I'm better than you, and I'm not better than you. I'm just myself, a child of God, and you're a child of God. What is important is that we can meet, and then meeting, we can transform each other.
What a gift he was, to us, to all of the world. We lost a wonderful man. But that sounds great. But for those, what are some of the practical realities of walking alongside, of meeting one another, and especially as people come back? It's safer to visit in prison, isn't it? Claudia, right? Yeah. I mean, now what's going to happen when he comes out and so on? It's there. You don't feel, but when he's got your phone number, and what's going to be expected of me now. Now we follow through in this handbook here some practical guidelines for friendship support. It's section 5. It starts on page 17. But here are some of the sort of major guidelines that touch on some of the things we talked about. Dismas is a fellowship, so we don't set ourselves to be unlike AA, to be a sponsor to men and women. We don't set ourselves up to be a mentor or to enter into formal counseling. Our group said we don't want to have that kind of liability in case something goes wrong. So we say, if you want to do that, if you want to involve yourselves in terms of a formal mentoring, sponsoring program, you may want to do that with another organization. But that doesn't mean you don't have coffee together. It's that you don't see one another. It's just we try to say up front. First thing you do in AA is you find a sponsor, right? If you want to enter into recovery, but that's something that we have refrained from doing. Okay. We say friendships are open and transparent. If you want to meet with a member outside the fellowship time, consult with a trusted leader before doing so, especially before exchanging telephone numbers or email addresses. No lone rangers. I think this is one of the key things with this. Vanier also talks about how a one-to-one helping relationship can be seductive. It can make you feel like you're a messiah, right? All this power to change. So really important that this be open and transparent and done in connection with others so they know what's happening, leadership knows what's happening, the group knows what's happening. People get in trouble when they're meeting apart from and behind the transparency of openness. Any questions or thoughts about that? Any experiences that should be brought to bear here? Yes, Joan.
I'm just wondering, do people then feel they're being rejected if the volunteer does not want to give them address and phone number and what? Do they consider this, oh, you don't really care about me, or?
No. Well, I suppose runs a bit of a risk. Basically, these kinds of directions are for the volunteers, like Claudia and you and I, who are coming in from the outside, who don't really appreciate the anguish and the depth of need and the possibilities for things to go offside in the same way that in walking with somebody. We haven't had that experience. We're basically saying, look, Joan, if you're here, you're just out of the prison for women, and you want to have a coffee with me. So I go to Bernie and say, Bernie, Joan and I wants to have a coffee. What do you think? It's over, and he's saying, not a great idea, or, I don't know if I can trust that, Joan. I don't know. Yeah. But it's not like that. But it's just that the relationships are above board. Too many experiences where people have their own agenda going on, Let me explain the situation with a story. We had a program called Compassionate Justice Teams. We tried to establish it. It was like circles for people who are population, who do not have a sexual offense. We got a number of people involved with it, and we had a team. It was a team walking two alongside one. And we matched this team up with Mark, who had just finished time for manslaughter inside. He was in a halfway house, a man and a woman. And I got a call from the halfway house. It was around Christmas time. Hey, I thought this thing was a team approach, Randy said. And I said, yeah, it is. He said, well, how come that the gal, his name happened to be Liz, how come she's seen him 8 times in the last 2 weeks over Christmas? And the other fella hasn't been around. So we had to call and say, what's going on? It appears like this gal, who was really a devout Catholic Christian, was going off with him to a church where they were practicing adoration, or they were doing, I don't know what was being adored there, but the halfway house said, this is a little bit questionable, and they didn't want it, and they didn't feel comfortable about this situation. So we went to her as a team and said, Liz, what's going on? And she had a reason why she was doing this on her own. I said, Liz, if you want to be part of the program, you're going to have to withdraw from that relationship, and we'll put you with somebody else. Or you continue your friendship on your own terms with the parole board's blessing, which she chose to do. And I think that they're still somewhat in touch. It's just that, and we get to it a bit, particularly in this question, what if we become more than friends? It could be wonderful, or it could be disastrous. Usually it can be the latter, frankly, where people really get hurt. And if it gets into this dating situation, it's normal. People need love, people need companionship, and you meet one another and things happen. The spark is struck. But it's not a dating service. And so if it's happening, we're not saying you can't do this. Open, transparent. What's going on here? Let it be so that the group, so we're not getting calls from the supervisor of the halfway house saying we're going to cut you off because this wasn't a dating thing, and we have real concerns about this. Maybe we're being too hard, but this is the direction that we've taken. That for the safety of the whole, continuance of the whole, that we would ask you to be transparent. We ask volunteers to be transparent when they're making contacts with people outside the community, at least certainly initially, and not to give out your phone number with checking with somebody. He wants my phone number. She wants my phone number. Is that okay? Things are going to go offside. We're people, right? things are going to get, perceptions are going to come into it and all the rest of that. We try to mitigate that, that's all. Any thoughts from the rest of the group? I think Joan is not convinced.
I'm just thinking.
Yes, yes. Try to provide, pieces of this are part of the orientation we give to volunteers. And by the way, orientation always includes former prisoners who can interpret what the culture is, who can share from their experience, even in the training of volunteers. And it's more like an orientation. It's not a hard-nosed training. But we go through this with people, and we advise that each new fellowship has this training, you know. And we're making it, right now, we're trying to get this training online on our network website so that members can access this training. It won't be up for a little while yet, but we are trying to do that. But I think you're right. It is advisable. On the other hand, I think it's common sense. If you go to an AA meeting, you're told, you know that it's not a dating program, right? If you go to a 12-step group. So we're following similar practices there. Other thoughts? This is the risk area we're getting into. Vanier talks about change. We're going to meet one another. We're going to hear the story. But then there's some, hey, let's do this with our feet on the ground, right? And even Jesus had problems with his disciples, didn't he? They went on, at least one of them went offside too. So any other thoughts on this? Oh, sorry. Where do we meet? Can he or she come to my home? Our suggestion is, at first, a coffee shop or a public place, if you're going to meet. You know, open your home only when you're comfortable doing so, and after consulting with trusted leadership. Again, that thing of openness. There's some guys I would never have in my home. Others, every Christmas we have guys in our home. But you have to be wise and knowledgeable. And wife and kids? Oh, no, don't bring them home. Absolutely. Yeah, good point. Know any conditions, especially involving children or other vulnerable persons. That person may have conditions you're not aware of, and you need to ask that question. Check with a halfway house before you're taking anyone out. Just make sure you do that. They may not even know that these plans have been made, but make sure that you have checked the boxes before this happens. Avoid becoming a landlord, employer, a banker. It'll almost always harm your friendship. Now you're always going to be asked for a loan. You're going to be asked for money. If you're not prepared to see that money, if it's small money and token money given as a gift or a small gift, and let it go, don't get in. The loan will ruin your relationship. Some of you have open homes. Some of us have open homes and so on. And sometimes that works out. I mean, we were talking here and some of the organizations that have opened their homes here in Manitoba, and it's been great. But by and large, if you're going to walk with somebody in the community, don't muddy the relationship. Right? Be a friend. Thoughts? What about confidentiality? Guard the confidentiality of your conversations with your friends. Don't reveal his or her name and the details of the offense. But if you receive information that could result in harm to others, especially children, you will need to discuss this information with trusted friendship, with trusted leadership immediately. Immediately. Don't have a choice on that. Do not allow another's crisis to become your crisis. If an individual says, don't tell anyone about this, it's usually that you're being manipulated. These are some suggestions, basic kind of suggestions about that walking with somebody in the community. I'll come back to that in a second. And there are more in the toolkit. There, you may have more guidance from the volunteer coordinators with Corrections Canada or with the provincial ministry too, in terms of what you can and cannot do, and you may want to take that training as well. But these are things that we have found to be important ways of preserving your friendship. And it may seem restrictive at first, but a little bit of tough love. This is a relationship. I want to talk about, just a second to close this, to talk a bit about mutuality. This is lovely. For me, this is Kesavan. Kesavan is an amazing guy who was a Sri Lankan guy who was caught up in some of the turbulence of the Malvern community in the East End of Toronto, and he was not himself directly, but he was involved with a homicide that he was given a life sentence, and has turned his life around. I met him first in prison. I remember one of the other prisoners saying to me, he was at Fenbrook, he said, "Harry, you've got to meet Kesavan. He's the real deal. He believes in restorative justice, and he had turned his life around. He had made a real commitment to opening his life to God. And right now, he's actually a Baptist minister in the East End of Hamilton. Has 4 kids. And a couple of years ago, I got a call from a parole officer who said Solomon's coming out, and he had a great relationship with his chaplain in prison. You know, is there any place where he could go? He'd really like to play basketball too. Well, Kesavan had their church was taking place in a school out there near the Toronto Zoo, and so we met for lunch and invited him to come in. There's a wonderful sense in which this mutuality occurs, you know. Kesavan has gone on to do some really amazing thing and a growing congregation. I want to conclude with this, which I find a little bit unrelated, but also totally, I think, related. Maybe some of you have even seen it.
In 2010, my doctor told me to buy a funeral plot because I would need one within the next 5 years. But I'm still here because a shelter dog saved my life. When people see what funeral was 5 years ago, they can't and often don't believe that it's me. My weight had crept up to 340 pounds. My blood pressure was through the roof, super high cholesterol. I had type 2 diabetes and I was taking over $1,000 worth of medications a month. And I just felt really uncomfortable around other people. I became separated from society and I just stopped living. I went on a business trip. You know how small airplane seats are. I could barely squeeze into one and basically I'd spill over both sides. They had to delay the flight because they didn't have a seatbelt extension that would fit me. There was a gentleman next to me and he just looked in complete disgust and he looked at me and he goes, "I'm going to miss my connection because you're too fat." That really was my bottom point. That's the point that I really decided that, you know, I'm either going to die or I have to do something. I looked in the phone book and I found the nutritionist near me. One of the first things that she asked me to do was to go adopt a shelter dog. It would force me to go outside. It would force me to become more socially interactive. So I went to the local shelter and I remember telling the lady I would like an obese middle-aged dog so that I would have something in common with him. And when I walked in the room, we both looked at each other with like a look of, really? That night, neither of us knew what to expect. And over a period of time, we really formed an inseparable bond and one that I'd never really experienced with another person or animal or anybody. We began walking for at least a half an hour a day, every day, and over the course of a year, just by changing what I ate and walking with Petey, I lost about 140 plus pounds. Everything about my life improved. I got off all meds. I no longer have type 2 diabetes. Petey also lost about 25 pounds, so we did it together. It was like a miracle. There you go. Woo, hi, Petey. So I read over Petey's paperwork when I adopted him, and it turns out that he was left alone in a backyard, and nobody played with him. He had arthritis and all kinds of rashes, and his skin was just itching all the time. He was wondering what would ever happen to him. He'd gone from being in a situation like I was, where he didn't have any friends and he didn't know anybody, and really became a proud dog. Are you ready for the next stop? beyond unconditional love.
Down, eat it, butter.
Petey taught me absolute loyalty. He looked at me in every sense as though I was the greatest person on the planet. I decided that I wanted to be the person who he thought I was. One of the things that I dreamed of doing was running a full marathon, and he looked at me like, you can do it, and I went out and I did it. This entire process brought me out of my shell and made me a different person. I knew that he was getting old and his time was coming. They discovered a really large cancerous growth on his spleen, and there was really nothing that they could do. I knew that he was going to die. I just lay with him on the floor. He just looked at me, and I could tell that the life had just passed out of him. And that was the end. And I just sat there and I held him. I loved him so much. I just was so sad. And, I'm still not over it. About 6 months later, after a race, suddenly just came into my mind, just drive over to the shelter right now. And I did. There's a dog that had been put in the adoption pen 4 minutes earlier. His photo wasn't on the wall, he wasn't on the website. And I just looked at him, and he looked at me, and he went, it was like, dude, let's get out of here. Jake is a completely different dog. Jake loves to play, and we started training, and he now runs 10-mile distances with me, and we're going to do our first half marathon together. He's the best running buddy I could possibly have. So really, thanks to Petey, I wake up every day wanting to be the best person that I can possibly be. He completely transformed me into a different person. I think about it now. Who rescued whom? I mean, did I rescue him or did he rescue me?
I don't think I have to say anything more. It's the metaphor is there. The mystery is there. The mystery of what we do. The mystery that keeps Ron going back 40 years. And Louis here 16 years after leaving farming. And there's this mystery of encountering what Jesus said. When did you see me in prison? There's this mystery, isn't there? And there's this mutuality that happens. And so the work that we do is like sacrament, isn't it? It's this. It is the encountering ourselves, our loving God, in the other. God bless you as you continue to work. I'm done here today. My throat's out, but unless you have more things to say, and if you want to hear more, come back tonight. Bring your checkbook for the. Thank you.